The first time a man breaks your heart, you blame yourself. The second time, you blame the gods. But when your fated mate, the Alpha King, drags you before the High Council, strips you of your crown, and banishes you to the frozen wastelands just to save his trembling mistress from the headsman's axe, you stop believing in anything but the cold. He threw me to the wolves, expecting me to die in the snow. 5 years later, he's bleeding on my doorstep, begging. The stone floor of the great hall was always freezing in November. It was a petty detail, but as I knelt before the iron-wrought throne, the bite of the frost seeping through the thin linen of my shift was the only thing keeping me anchored to my body. Above me sat Kalen. He did not look like a king in that moment. He looked like a cornered animal. His jaw was locked tight enough to crack his teeth, and his knuckles were bone white where they gripped the armrests. Beside him, standing where I should have been, was Livia. She wore a cloak of spun silver fox, my cloak, I noted dully, and clutched Kalen's shoulder like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood. Maeve of the Ironwood, Kalen's voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It was flat, empty. The rich, rumbling timbre that used to whisper my name in the dark was entirely gone. You stand accused of high treason, of plotting to open the northern gates to the savage packs, and of attempting to poison the King's Ward. The King's Ward, that was the polite, courtly title they gave Livia. Mistress was too ugly a word for the council ledgers. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I had already spent all my tears 2 nights ago in the damp dark of the dungeon when Kalen had come to my cell. He had stood on the other side of the iron bars, smelling of cedar and her lavender perfume, and told me what he was going to do. Livia had forged the letters. Livia had dealt with the northern rogues to buy herself rare silks and jewels, bungling the negotiations so badly it nearly cost us the border. The council wanted blood. The law demanded an execution. I can't let them kill her, Maeve, he had whispered in the dark, his golden eyes avoiding mine. I can't. She's fragile. She won't survive the block. You are strong. You are an Ironwood. You can survive exile. Take the blame. I will sever the bond. I will spare your life. Just leave. My silence in the great hall was loud. The gathered lords and pack alphas shifted uncomfortably in their heavy furs. They knew. Half of them knew it was a farce. But a king's word was law, and Kalen was willing to burn his fated mate to keep his pet warm. "Do you deny these charges?" Kalen asked. His voice wavered on the last syllable, a microscopic fracture in his armor. I looked up. I didn't look at Livia. She wasn't worth my focus. I looked dead into Kalen's eyes. I let the mating bond, the invisible, golden thread that tethered our souls together, flare to life one last time. I felt his heart skip. I felt his shame, hot and sickening, bleeding through the connection. "I deny nothing that you have already decided is truth, Your Grace," I said. My voice was raspy from disuse, but steady. "Do what you must." Livia let out a theatrical, shuddering breath and buried her face in Kalen's neck. He flinched, then stiffened. "Then, by the blood of the first wolves," Kalen proclaimed, standing up, "I strip you of your title, I strip you of your pack, and I sever the tie between us." He raised his hand. The ritual words tumbled from his lips in the old tongue. I braced myself. But you cannot brace for the severing of a soul. It didn't feel like magic. It felt like a butcher's hook catching under my ribs and ripping upward. I tasted copper. My vision went white, then black, then a horrific, swimming grey. I collapsed forward, my hand slapping against the freezing stone. I heard my own wolf scream in the back of my mind, a long, agonizing howl of a creature being torn in half, before she went, violently, terrifyingly silent. The mark on my neck, where Kalen's teeth had scarred me, claiming me as his, burned like a branding iron. Blood trickled down my collarbone. "You have until sundown to cross the river," Kaelin said. He was already turning away. He couldn't even watch me bleed. "If you are found in Exiled after the moon rises, you will be hunted." Guards hoisted me up by my armpits. My legs were numb. The world felt hollowed out, as if the air had been sucked from the room. They dragged me down the central aisle. The lords and ladies who had toasted my health a month ago now averted their eyes, staring at their boots or the tapestries. Cowards, all of them. They threw me out the heavy oak doors of the keep. I landed hard in the slush and mud of the courtyard. The winter wind howled off the mountains, biting through my thin shift. I lay there for a moment, tasting the dirt. My wolf was quiet. My chest was empty. The bond was a jagged, bleeding crater. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees. The cold was a shock, but it was real. It was better than the suffocating warmth of that throne room. I stood up. My bare feet sank into the freezing mud. I did not look back at the towering spires of the castle. I turned my face to the wind, wiped the blood from my neck, and started walking north. Survival is not romantic. It is not a poetic journey of self-discovery. It is blisters bursting and reforming into calluses. It is the violent ache in your gut when you haven't eaten in 3 days. It is learning to sleep with one eye open, a rusted hunting knife clutched in your fist. The first winter nearly killed me. Without the pack bond, a werewolf's immune system crashes. My healing slowed to a human crawl. I shifted into my wolf form just to keep from freezing to death, living as a feral beast for months in the deep pines. I forgot the sound of my own voice. I forgot the concept of fire. I existed only to hunt, to chew raw meat from the bones of starved deer, and to keep moving. Eventually, the spring thaw forced me out of the woods. I stumbled into Oakhaven, a miserable, mud-drenched logging village on the edge of the unclaimed territories. I collapsed by the well, half-starved, covered in mud and dried blood. A blacksmith named Gareth found me. He was a human, a massive, quiet man with soot permanently ground into the lines of his face. He didn't ask questions. He threw a wool blanket over me, dragged me into his shop, and forced hot broth down my throat. Over the next 4 years, Oakhaven became my world. I traded my royal posture for an axe. I split wood until my shoulders burned. I learned to skin rabbits, to tan hides with oak bark and brains, to negotiate with the rough traders who came through before the snows hit. My hair, once glossed and braided with silver chains, I chopped off with a hunting knife when it got too long. My hands, once soft enough to wear silk gloves, grew rough as bark, permanently stained with dirt and grease. I didn't just survive. I hardened. I became an anchor in the village. When the rogue wolves came sniffing around the livestock, I met them at the tree line. I didn't need a pack behind me. I was a lone wolf, and my eyes held the cold, dead promise of a woman who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. They left us alone. Gareth and I formed a quiet partnership. No sweeping romance, no desperate vows in the dark. Just shared meals by the hearth, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer on the anvil, and the comfortable silence of two people who understood that the world was a harsh, unforgiving place. He knew I was a wolf. He didn't care. To him, I was just Maeve. But the world outside Oakhaven didn't stay quiet. News travelled with the merchants. The kingdom of Exiled was rotting. It started as whispers over ale. A bad harvest, a sickness spreading through the southern herds. Then the rumours grew darker. The pack magic was failing. An alpha's strength is tied to his mate and his pack. When Kaelin severed our fated bond, he didn't just break me. He severed his own route to the earth. He tried to mate Livia, But the moon goddess does not bless the usurpers. Livia bore no children. Her body, fragile and human soft, rejected the bite. She remained sickly, prone to coughing fits and paranoia. Without a true Luna to balance the Alpha's energy, Kaelin's rule grew erratic. The merchants spoke of exorbitant taxes, brutal punishments for minor offences, and a standing army that was slowly starving in their barracks. The border packs were rebelling. The kingdom was bleeding out. "They say the king hasn't shifted in a year," an old trader muttered one night in the tavern, wiping ale from his beard. I was sitting at a table in the corner, mending a torn leather harness. I kept my head down, pulling the bone needle through the tough hide. "Heard he's going mad," another man replied. "Talking to ghosts in the great hall. The mistress stays locked in her chambers. The eastern lords are rallying an army to depose him. Serves the bastard right," Gareth rumbled from the bar, slamming his empty mug down. He threw a brief, protective glance my way. A man who breaks his oaths deserves to be broken by them. I didn't say anything. I tied off the sinew thread and bit the end. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy at Kaelin's downfall. The love I once had for him was a corpse I had buried deep in the frozen earth of my first winter. I just felt a profound, exhausting apathy. Let them rot. They had earned it. I walked out of the tavern into the crisp autumn's air. The wind was shifting, carrying the sharp scent of pine and coming snow. I looked up at the moon. It was full, cold, and indifferent. Just like me. The fifth winter in Oakhaven arrived with the ferocity of an invading army. By January, the snow was piled as high as the rooftops, and the river was frozen solid enough to drive a wagon across. We spent our days huddled by the hearths, venturing out only to feed the animals or hack ice from the well. I was behind Gareth's forge, chopping firewood. The rhythmic thwack of the axe splitting logs was a meditation. My breath plumed in the freezing air, my muscles warm despite the biting cold. Then the wind changed. I stopped mid-swing. The axe head buried itself in the chopping block with a heavy thud. I went completely still, my nostrils flaring. Underneath the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and ozone, there was a scent. It was faint, buried under layers of dirt and sweat. But my wolf woke up for the first time in months. She didn't howl, she snarled. Pine needles, old iron, and the undeniable, sickly sweet stench of rotting magic. Kaelin, I didn't panic. I didn't drop my axe. I calmly gripped the wooden handle, pulled it free from the block, and turned toward the village square. They emerged from the tree line like a procession of ghosts. There were only 4 riders. Their horses were gaunt, ribs showing through their shaggy winter coats, their heads hanging low. The men were in no better shape. Their cloaks were ragged, their armor rusted and dull. The villagers stepped out of their homes, holding pitchforks and hammers, eyeing the intruders with silent hostility. Oakhaven didn't like strangers, especially desperate ones. The lead rider pulled his horse to a halt near the well. He didn't dismount. He practically fell out of the saddle. His knees hit the packed snow, and he stayed there for a long moment, leaning heavily on a scarred broadsword. I walked slowly into the square, my boots crunching in the snow. I rested the head of my axe on the ground, leaning on the handle. The man lifted his head. If I hadn't known his scent, I wouldn't have recognized him. The Kaelin I knew, the golden, vibrant Alpha, who commanded rooms with a laugh and broke hearts with a smile, was dead. The man kneeling in the snow was a hollow shell. His dark hair was streaked with coarse grey and hung in matted clumps. His face was gaunt, his cheekbones jutting out sharply above a scruffy, unkempt beard. The skin around his eyes was bruised purple, and his golden irises were dull, clouded with pain and exhaustion. He looked at me. His breath hitched, a ragged, wheezing sound that carried in the quiet square. "Maeve," he rasped. It sounded like a death rattle. I looked down at him. I felt nothing. No flutter in my chest, no spark of old fury, just the mild irritation of finding a wounded rabid dog in your yard. "You're trespassing," I said flatly. "Please." He tried to stand, using his sword as a crutch, but his legs gave out. He crashed back to his knees. One of his guards stepped forward to help him, but Kaelin waved him off weakly. "Please, Maeve, I've been riding for weeks, tracking you." "You shouldn't have bothered," I replied, turning my back to him. "Gareth, fetch the boys. Chase these strays back into the woods. Livia is dead." The words stopped me. I turned my head slightly, looking at him over my shoulder. Kaelin was shaking, whether from the cold or the fever burning in his eyes. I couldn't tell. "She died 2 moons ago. The winter fever took her. But she was already gone, Maeve. The sickness, the rot in the land. It took her mind first." "Tragic," I said. My voice was dry as ash. "My condolences. Now leave." "The pack is dying," he suddenly yelled, his voice cracking violently. He dropped his sword and crawled forward a pace, his bloody, ungloved hands digging into the snow. "The magic is completely gone. The children are being born sick. The crops turn to ash in the soil. The Eastern Lords have besieged the capital. I have nothing left. You have exactly what you chose." I turned fully to face him now. I walked closer, stopping just out of his arm's reach. I wanted him to see my face clearly. I wanted him to see the silver scar on my neck, the rough calluses on my hands, the cold emptiness in my eyes. "You chose her. You chose the lie. You broke the bond." "I was a fool," he sobbed, the great Alpha King breaking down in the mud and snow of a peasant village. Tears tracked through the dirt on his face. I was arrogant. I thought I could cheat the goddess. I thought I could save her and keep the kingdom. But I lost everything. I lost my soul when I lost you. He looked up at me, a pathetic, desperate hunger in his ruined eyes. "The elders, they say the only way to heal the land, the only way to restore the pack magic, is to mend the severed bond. You have to come back, Maeve. You have to take the crown. I'll give you everything. I'll step down. I'll let you rule. Just, please, save my people. Save me." He lunged forward, trying to grab the hem of my coarse wool skirt. I stepped back, swift and graceful, and brought the heavy, flat side of my axe blade down hard on his outstretched hand. Kaelin screamed, pulling his hand back to his chest, curling into a ball in the snow. His guards drew their swords, but 6 villagers, including Gareth, leveled loaded crossbows at them. The guards froze. I stood over the writhing king, my expression unchanging. "Your people. They watched you throw me to the ice," I said quietly, making sure every word dropped like a stone. "And as for you, I wouldn't cross the street to piss on you if you were on fire, Kaelin." I leaned in closer, my voice a dangerous whisper. "You exiled a Luna. What you found in the snow is a monster of your own making, and this monster doesn't know how to forgive. We didn't let him freeze. That wasn't an act of mercy, it was an act of sanitation. Dead bodies draw scavengers, and the ground was too hard to dig a grave." Gareth dragged Kaelin by the collar of his ruined cloak and dumped him in the woodshed behind the forge. It was draughty, smelling of sawdust and damp earth, but it had 4 walls and a roof. I tossed one of Kaelin's terrified guards a threadbare blanket and a bucket of water. I didn't offer food. We barely had enough grain to see the village through February. Let the king eat his pride. For 3 days, Kaelin drifted in and out of a fever dream. I ignored him. I fell back into my routine. I chopped wood. I checked the snare lines at the edge of the territory. I sat by the hearth in the evenings, watching the flames devour the pine logs, feeling absolutely nothing about the man bleeding out 50 yards from my back door. Sometimes, when the wind died down, I could hear him muttering my name in his delirium. It sounded like a prayer from a dying religion. I simply drank my tea and listened to the rhythmic scrape of Gareth sharpening his broadsword on the whetstone. On the fourth morning, the sky was the colour of a bruised iron kettle. The air was dead. Too quiet. I was at the well, hauling up a bucket, when the scent hit me. It wasn't the pathetic, rotting smell of Kaelin's broken magic. This was sharp, aggressive. It smelled like oiled leather, wet horsehair, and the metallic tang of adrenaline. A lot of it. I dropped the wooden bucket. It slammed against the stone wall of the well, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the silent square. Gareth stepped out of the forge, wiping grease from his massive hands with a rag. He took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. He turned around and grabbed his hammer. "Ring the iron," I told Corin, a young village boy who had been fetching firewood. The boy scrambled to the center of the square and began frantically yanking the rope attached to a rusted church bell. The harsh, clanging alarm echoed off the mountains. Doors slammed open. The villagers poured out, their faces pale, clutching whatever they could find. Pitchforks, hunting bows, logging axes. We were a frontier town. We knew what an approaching army smelled like. They breached the tree line 20 minutes later. It was a vanguard of the Eastern Rebellion. About 50 men, riding heavy war horses equipped for the snow. They wore thick furs over chainmail, their banners depicting the blood-red hawk of Lord Bram. They didn't look like honorable liberators aiming to dethrone a mad king. They looked like men who had been at war for months, starved of morality and hungry for a slaughter. They fanned out, creating a semicircle that pinned our small village against the frozen river. Lord Bram rode at the center. I recognized him from my past life. Back then, he had been a sycophant, a man who kissed Kaelin's ring and sent me lavish gifts of silk on my birthdays. Now, his face was scarred, his beard braided with iron beads, and his eyes held the arrogant cruelty of a man who realized there were no rules left. The villagers formed a ragged line behind me, 50 peasants against 50 heavily armed cavalrymen. It was a joke, but nobody ran. Oakhaven people didn't run, because there was nowhere to run to. Bram pulled his massive roan stallion to a halt 10 yards from me. He leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking on to me. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Maeve," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. He looked at my chopped, messy hair. He looked at the heavy leather armor I wore over my wool tunic, and the long, double-bearded splitting axe resting easily in my right hand. "By the goddess, is that really you?" "Lord Bram," I replied. My voice was a flat, carrying baritone. "You're off your usual patrol routes. The capital is 300 miles south." He barked a harsh laugh. "The capital is burning, my lady. The kingdom is ours. We are just cleaning up the refuse." He gestured toward the woodshed with a mailed fist. "My scouts tracked a pack of starving deserters this way. We know the false king is here. Hand him over. We want his head on a spike before sundown." I didn't flinch. I felt the collective gaze of the village burning into my back. "The man in the shed is a vagrant," I said evenly. "He dies of winter fever in a day or two. Leave him to the rot. He isn't worth your steel." Bram's smile vanished. His horse danced nervously, blowing steam into the cold air. "I wasn't asking for your permission, Exiled Luna. We know he's there. Step aside. I have 50 men ready to burn this pathetic mud hole to the ground if I have to. Try it." The words didn't come from me. They came from the doorway of the woodshed. Kaelin stood there. He looked like a corpse, dragged from a river. He was leaning heavily on the doorframe, his face the color of dirty chalk, his breath coming in shallow, agonizing gasps. He had somehow managed to strap his rusted broadsword to his hip. It was a pathetic display of bravado. Bram laughed. It was a cruel, booming sound that echoed across the snow. His men joined in, a chorus of mockery. "The mighty Alpha King," Bram sneered, drawing his own longsword. The steel sang a deadly note in the crisp air. "Look at you, reduced to hiding behind the skirts of the woman you threw to the dogs. It's almost poetic." Kalen stumbled forward. He didn't look at Bram. He looked at me. His eyes were desperate, silently pleading with me to run, to save myself. It was the first selfless look I had seen on his face in 5 years, and it disgusted me. It was too late for nobility. "I surrender," Kalen choked out, turning his gaze back to Bram. "Take me. Leave the village. Leave her. Your war is with me. My war is with anyone who breathes Ethelgard air and defies me," Bram spat. He pointed his sword directly at my chest. "Kill the king. Burn the village. Take the women. The new era doesn't leave loose ends." His men drew their weapons. The metallic scrape of 50 swords, clearing their scabbards, set my teeth on edge. I looked at Kalen, standing there shivering in the snow, offering himself up like a sacrificial lamb. Then I looked at Bram. I didn't care about Kalen. I didn't care about his rotting crown or his shattered kingdom. But this was my dirt. These were my people. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the frozen air fill my lungs. I let the apathy die. I reached down into the dark, cold crater where my mating bond used to be, and I grabbed hold of the raw, feral survival instinct that had kept me alive in the pine forests. My eyes flashed bright, luminous gold. A low, terrifying growl built in my chest, rumbling out of my throat with enough force to make Bram's warhorse rear back in panic. "Nobody burns my town," I said. Violence, when executed correctly, is just a problem-solving equation. Speed, mass, and angles. I didn't have the luxury of a pack's magical strength backing me, but I had 5 years of felling ancient oak trees and fighting feral rogues for scraps of meat. Bram kicked his horse forward, aiming to trample me before I could react. I didn't step back. I lunged. I dropped low, dodging the swinging hooves of the warhorse. As the beast passed over me, I swung my axe in a brutal upward arc. The heavy iron blade bit deep into the unarmored belly of the horse. The animal screamed, a horrifying, shrill sound, and collapsed sideways. Bram was thrown from the saddle. He hit the packed snow hard, his chainmail clattering, before his men could comprehend that a single woman had just grounded their commander. Gareth roared. The blacksmith stepped past me, swinging a massive sledgehammer in a wide, lethal arc. The hammer connected with the chest of the nearest rider, caving in his armor with a sickening crunch and throwing him out of his saddle. The village erupted. Crossbows snapped, sending iron-tipped bolts into the cavalry. Men screamed. The tight, disciplined formation of the eastern vanguard broke into chaotic, bloody skirmishes in the snow. I didn't watch the battle. I stayed focused on Bram. He scrambled to his feet, spitting blood and snow. He raised his broadsword, his eyes wide with shock and sudden, desperate fury. "You stupid bitch!" he bellowed. He charged. He was fast, trained in the elite courtyards of the capital, his strikes precise and textbook perfect. He swung a heavy overhead cleave. I parried, catching his blade on the reinforced steel shaft of my axe. The impact sent a shockwave up my arms, but my footing held. I twisted my wrists, locking his blade, and stepped into his guard. I drove my knee upward, burying it into his stomach, right below the edge of his breastplate. Bram wheezed, stumbling back. He had expected a Luna. He had expected a woman trained in courtly dances and defensive pack magic. He didn't know how to fight a street brawler who had spent half a decade butchering her own meat. I didn't give him room to breathe. I pressed the attack, swinging my axe in tight, relentless arcs. Clang, clang, clang. The sheer kinetic force of my blows battered his guard. He was backpedaling, slipping on the bloody snow. "You're fighting for a dead man!" Bram screamed, parrying a strike that nearly took his ear off. "He ruined you! Why are you protecting him?" "I'm not!" I roared back. I feinted a low sweep at his knees. He dropped his sword to block. It was a mistake. I reversed my grip mid-swing, bringing the heavy wooden butt of the axe handle up in a vicious uppercut. It caught him square under the jaw. The crack of his mandible fracturing was loud enough to be heard over the clash of steel around us. Bram's eyes rolled back in his head. He crumpled to the snow like a puppet with cut strings. The fighting around us faltered. The eastern soldiers, seeing their commander lying unconscious and bleeding in the dirt, hesitated. Gareth was standing over 2 dead riders, his hammer dripping. The villagers held the line, bruised and terrified, but unyielding. "Take him," I commanded, my chest heaving. I pointed my axe at Bram's limp body, sweeping my golden gaze across the remaining riders. The feral edge in my voice left no room for negotiation. "Take him, and ride back to whatever burning rock you crawled out from. If you cross the tree line into Oakhaven again, I won't leave a single one of you breathing to carry the message." The riders exchanged nervous glances. They were bullies, emboldened by a crumbling kingdom, faced with a town willing to bleed and a woman who had just dismantled their lord in 60 seconds. Their courage evaporated. 2 soldiers dismounted, grabbed Bram by his arms, and hauled his unconscious body across a riderless horse. They didn't say a word. They turned their mounts and spurred them back toward the forest, the remnants of their vanguard fleeing like whipped curs. The silence that fell over the village was heavy. The only sounds were the wind howling through the pines and the soft moans of the injured. I stood in the center of the square, staring at the tree line until the last of them vanished. My hands were shaking, the adrenaline slowly receding to leave a cold, hollow ache in my bones. I lowered my axe. The blade was chipped, stained with horse blood. I turned around. Kalen was still leaning against the woodshed. He hadn't moved. He had watched the entire thing. His eyes were wide, fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound, devastating realization. He was looking at the woman he had thrown away. He had exiled a girl who wore silk and cried in dungeons. He had come crawling back, looking for a savior. What he found was a warlord. I walked slowly back toward the forge. The villagers parted for me, their eyes filled with a new, quiet reverence. I didn't acknowledge them. I walked straight up to Kalen. He shrank back slightly as I approached, instinctively bracing himself. I stopped inches from his face. I could smell his fear, sharp and acrid. I reached out, my blood-stained hand grabbing the collar of his tunic. I yanked him forward so hard his teeth clicked together. "Understand this," I whispered, my voice a deadly hiss. "I didn't save you. I protected my porch. If your war comes to my doorstep again, Kalen, I won't wait for them to kill you. I will cut your head off myself and hand it to them." I shoved him backward. He hit the doorframe and slid down to the snow, burying his face in his hands. He was crying again. Small, pathetic sobs that made my stomach churn. "Gareth," I called out, not taking my eyes off the broken king. "Yeah, Maeve," the blacksmith answered, stepping up behind me. "Get him back in the shed. Bar the door from the outside." I finally turned away, walking toward the warmth of my cabin. Tomorrow, we march him out of the territory. I don't care if he dies on the road. He is no longer my problem. But as I closed my door and leaned against the heavy wood, listening to the winter wind rattle the windows, a dark, unsettling truth gnawed at the back of my mind. The rebellion had seen me. Bram knew I was alive. Kalen was a dead man walking. But by defending this ground, I had just painted a massive target on my own back. The kingdom I had left to rot was coming to claim me anyway. Morning came with the bitter bite of a hard freeze. The kind of cold that turns your breath to ice in your throat and makes the floorboards groan under your boots. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, watching the embers die in the hearth, sharpening my axe with a whetstone until the rhythmic shock, shock sound was the only thing I could hear. I was waiting for the guilt to hit me. For the old Maeve, the soft, trusting Luna who cried in the dungeon, to rear her head and beg me to show Kaelin mercy. She never showed up. When the sun finally broke over the eastern ridge, painting the snow in pale, sickly yellow light, I stood up. I strapped my axe to my back, pulled on my heavy wool coat, and walked out into the square. The village was already awake. You don't sleep in after a battle. Men were patching the roof of the tavern where a stray crossbow bolt had shattered the shingles. Women were hauling away the carcasses of the eastern horses, dragging them toward the butchering sheds. Meat was meat, and winter was long. Gareth was standing by the well, leaning heavily on his hammer. His face was grey with exhaustion, a crude bandage wrapped around his left bicep, where a sword had grazed him. "Wagons hitched," he said as I approached. He jerked his chin toward a flatbed cart hitched to 2 of our draft horses. Corin put some straw in the back. Not that the bastard deserves it. He doesn't, I agreed. But I don't want his frozen corpse stinking up the cart before we hit the territory line. We walked to the woodshed together. Gareth unbarred the heavy wooden door and kicked it open. Kaelin was a pile of rags in the corner. He didn't look up when the light hit him. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard I could hear it over the wind. The fever had completely consumed him. His skin was waxy, a terrifying shade of translucent white, and his lips were tinged blue. "Up!" Gareth barked. Kaelin didn't move. He just curled tighter into a ball, clutching his chest. "It's cold," he rasped, the words barely audible. "The earth. It's so cold." Gareth grabbed him by the scruff of his ruined tunic and hauled him to his feet. Kaelin's legs buckled instantly. He would have hit the dirt if the blacksmith wasn't holding him up like a broken doll. "Get him in the wagon," I said, turning away. I had no patience for this. The sooner he was gone, the sooner Oakhaven could prepare for Bram's inevitable retaliation. "Maeve," Kaelin's voice wasn't a plea this time. It was a wet, heavy croak. He reached out with a trembling, frost-bitten hand and grabbed the sleeve of my coat. I stopped, staring down at his fingers. They were stained black at the tips. Necrosis. You think you're safe here?" he wheezed, his head lolling to the side to look at me. His golden eyes were entirely bloodshot. "You think the rot is just a political problem? Just Ethelgard? I think you need to let go of my coat before I break your wrist," I said evenly. He didn't let go. His grip tightened with a sudden, desperate surge of manic strength. "The bond is broken. The alpha magic is bleeding out. The earth feels it, Maeve. The goddess is stripping the life from the dirt. It started in the south, but it's crawling north." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and spat a glob of dark, bloody phlegm into the snow. "Check the well." I stared at him. "What?" "Check the water," he gasped, his eyes rolling back in his head. The effort of speaking had drained him. He went entirely limp in Gareth's grip, slipping back into unconsciousness. I looked at Gareth. The big man frowned, his brow furrowing in deep lines. He dragged Kaelin toward the cart and dumped him unceremoniously into the straw. I walked slowly toward the stone well in the center of the square. Corin was standing there, a wooden bucket resting on the stone lip. The boy looked pale, his eyes wide and frightened. "Corin," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "What's wrong?" He didn't speak. He just pointed a trembling finger into the bucket. I stepped up and looked inside. The water we drew from the deep aquifers of the Ironwood Mountains was famously clear. It tasted like minerals and clean ice. But the water sloshing in the wooden bucket wasn't clear. It was a murky, foul-smelling grey. Swirls of thick, oily black sediment drifted through it, smelling faintly of sulphur and decaying leaves. I grabbed the bucket and tipped it over, pouring the water onto the snow. The snow hissed faintly, turning a sickly yellow-brown where the water hit it. The grass at the edge of the well, dead and dormant for the winter, instantly curled and blackened into ash. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over me. Kaelin wasn't lying. It wasn't just a drought or a bad harvest down south. The severed bond between an Alpha King and his fated Luna was a violation of the old laws. The magic of the land was tied to the pack, and the pack was tied to the crown. Without balance, the magic was turning toxic. The earth was dying, and it had finally reached Oakhaven. Gareth walked up beside me, staring at the black stain on the snow. He didn't swear. He just let out a long, heavy breath. "Well," the blacksmith rumbled quietly, "we can fight an army. We can't fight poisoned dirt." I looked out at the village, at the rough-hewn cabins, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the faces of the people who had taken me in when I was nothing but a starving, feral beast. They were tough. They could survive raiders, winters, and starvation. But they couldn't survive the land itself, rotting beneath their feet. If I kicked Kaelin out, he died. The magic died with him, and Oakhaven would turn into a poisoned wasteland by spring. I looked back at the cart, where the man who had ruined my life lay shivering in the dirty straw. I hated him. I hated him with a pure, crystalline intensity that burned hot in my chest. But hatred is a luxury. Survival is a necessity. "Unload him," I told Gareth. Gareth looked at me, surprised. "You're keeping him?" "No," I said, my voice hardening into iron. I turned away from the well and walked toward my cabin to pack my gear. "We're taking him back." Packing didn't take long. When you spend 5 years treating every day like it might be your last, you don't accumulate much sentiment. I packed dried venison, heavy wool blankets, medical supplies, and an extra axe head. When I stepped back out into the square, a small crowd had gathered. Gareth was standing by his own horse, a massive, foul-tempered gelding. He had a heavy chainmail shirt strapped over his chest, and his sledgehammer resting on his shoulder. Beside him stood 3 other men from the village, armed with hunting bows and spears. "What's this?" I asked, dropping my pack into the dirt. "A hunting party," Gareth said flatly. "You think you're marching into the capital with a half-dead king on your back, all by yourself? Bram's men will butcher you before you hit the southern crossing." "I am a wolf, Gareth. You are humans. If we hit an Ethelgard patrol, you will be slaughtered." "We saw you handle Bram," Corin's father, a logger named Harlan, spoke up. He spat a wad of tobacco into the snow. "You're a fine killer, Maeve, but you can't watch your own back while you sleep. We owe you. Oakhaven pays its debts." I looked at their hard, determined faces. Arguing with mountain loggers was like arguing with a stone wall. And secretly, practically, I knew they were right. I needed a vanguard. "Fine," I said, "but we move fast. If you fall behind, I leave you." I walked over to the flatbed cart. Kaelin had regained a sliver of consciousness. He was propped up against the wooden sideboards, watching me with a mixture of terror and agonizing hope. He thought I had forgiven him. He thought I was coming back to save him. I grabbed the front of his tunic and hauled him upright. He gasped, clutching his chest. "Listen to me very carefully," I said. I kept my voice low, for his ears only. "I am not returning to be your Luna. I am not returning to mend your broken heart, or to stand beside your throne, or to forgive you for tossing me to the wolves so your pathetic mistress could keep her head." His eyes widened, the faint spark of hope dying instantly, replaced by sheer panic. "Maeve, please! The bond! The bond is dead!" I snarled, cutting him off. "You killed it! I am not going south to save you. I am going south to save my dirt." I reached for his right hand. He tried to pull back, but he was weak. I grabbed his fingers, finding the heavy gold ring on his index finger. The Alpha Sigil. The ancient crest of the Exiled crown. It was the physical anchor of the pack's magic. "What are you doing?" He panicked, his breathing turning ragged. "You can't. Only the reigning Alpha." "You aren't an Alpha anymore, Kalen," I said coldly. "You're a parasite." I twisted the ring and yanked it off his finger. The moment the gold cleared his knuckle, Kalen screamed. It was a horrifying, guttural sound of pure, magical severing. He collapsed back into the straw, convulsing, his hands clutching his head. I stood there, staring at the heavy gold ring in my palm. The metal was ice cold. Without hesitating, I slid it onto my own right index finger. It was too big, but the magic didn't care about size. The moment the gold touched my skin, a violent, terrifying surge of electricity shot up my arm. It wasn't the warm, golden light of a mating bond. This was raw, aggressive, stolen power. The dormant pack magic, desperate for an anchor, slammed into my chest like a battering ram. My vision flashed white. My bones felt like they were vibrating. I dropped to one knee, gasping for air, clutching my chest as the magic tried to burn me alive. The power recognized the lunar mark scarred onto my neck, but it also recognized the void where the fated bond should have been. It fought me. It clawed at my insides, trying to reject a host that was taking it by force rather than by sacred right. Mine, I snarled internally. I didn't let the magic overwhelm me. I pushed back with 5 years of cold, hardened fury. Submit. The power buckled. It snapped into place, anchoring itself in the dark, empty crater in my chest. I slowly stood up. The air around me felt different. Sharper. Heavier. I could feel the faint, distant heartbeats of the Exiled wolves, hundreds of miles away. I could feel their sickness, their fear, their starvation. It was a suffocating weight, but I forced my shoulders back and carried it. I looked down at Kalen. He had stopped convulsing. He lay in the straw, staring up at me with absolute, unadulterated awe. He was entirely empty now. Just a human man in a dying wolf's body. "You took it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You forced the mantle." "I am the Alpha now," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It carried a strange, dual resonance. My voice, layered with the ancient, commanding rumble of the pack magic. I turned to Gareth. The villagers were staring at me, wide-eyed, instinctively stepping back from the sheer aura of authority radiating off me. "Tie him to the back of the cart," I ordered, pointing at Kalen. "If he wants to return to his kingdom, he can walk." "Maeve, he's dying," Gareth said, hesitation crossing his face for the first time. "He won't survive 5 miles on foot in the snow." "Then he dies on his feet," I replied, my face a mask of stone. "Tie him up." I walked to my horse and swung up into the saddle. I didn't look back at the woodshed, or my cabin, or the life I was leaving behind. I pointed my horse south toward the rotting heart of Exiled. I was going back to the place that had broken me, not as a victim, and not as a savior. I was returning as a conqueror. We marched south for 14 days. The first week was just the brutal, honest cold of the mountains. The second week was when we hit the rot. The snow stopped being white. It turned a sickly, bruised grey, dusted with an ash that didn't come from any fire. The pine trees, usually resilient against the harshest winters, were stripped bare, their trunks oozing a foul black sap. We crossed rivers that smelled of copper and stagnation, the ice cracked and weeping yellow water. Behind the wagon, Kalen walked. He fell, constantly. The rope tied to his wrists would snap taut, jerking him forward, dragging his knees through the frozen mud until he scrambled back to his feet. I never ordered the cart to stop. Gareth rode beside him, occasionally offering a canteen of water when Caelan's lips cracked and bled down his chin, but there was no pity in the blacksmith's eyes, only the grim duty of keeping the prisoner alive. Caelan stopped asking for forgiveness on the third day. The manic hope that I was coming back to heal his heart had been crushed under the relentless, rhythmic plodding of the draft horses. Stripped of the alpha magic, he was aging rapidly. The grey in his hair turned to stark white, his cheekbones hollowed out. He looked like a man of 70, broken and hollowed out by the elements. On the 10th day, we entered the Valley of Oakhaven's neighbouring territory. It was a graveyard. A farming village sat at the crossroads, but no smoke rose from the chimneys. The fields were black. Livestock lay rotting in the pens, their rib cages burst open by scavengers. As we rode through the centre of the town, I saw the bodies. Men, women, and children, wrapped in whatever blankets they had, frozen solid on their porches. They hadn't been killed by raiders. They had starved, their immune systems crashing as the pack magic abandoned the earth. I pulled my horse to a halt. The wagon groaned to a stop behind me. Caelan collapsed into the ash-covered snow. He didn't try to get up. He just lay there, his breath rattling in his chest, staring at a frozen woman clutching a dead infant on the porch of the nearest cabin. "Get up," I said. My voice broke the suffocating silence of the dead village. Caelan slowly pushed himself onto his hands and knees. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the bodies. Tears cut clean tracks through the grime on his face, dropping onto the poisoned earth. "I did this," he whispered. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a horrifying, absolute realization. For Livia. I traded all of them for Livia. And she hated me at the end. She screamed when I touched her. She said I smelled like a corpse. She was right, I said coldly. I dismounted and walked toward him. My boots crunched in the dead snow. I stopped beside him, looking down at his trembling form. You broke the sacred laws to save a woman who forged treason to buy silk. You thought love absolved you of duty? But this isn't a ballad, Caelan. This is reality. The earth doesn't care about your broken heart. It only cares about the blood it was promised. He looked up at me. His golden eyes were gone, replaced by a dull, milky, human brown. "Why didn't you let them kill me?" he choked out. "Why bring me back? Just cut my throat. Let the dirt have me." "Because your death needs to mean something," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If I kill you in the woods, you die a martyr to the loyalists. You die a tragic king. I am going to march you through the gates of your own city. I am going to let your starving people look at the man who murdered them. I am going to strip you of your humanity, just like you stripped me of mine." I grabbed the rope tying him to the cart and gave it a violent yank. "Walk!" I commanded. He stumbled to his feet, his head hanging in absolute defeat. He didn't speak again for the rest of the journey. On the 14th day, the jagged, iron-wrought spires of the capital pierced the grey horizon. Ethelgard, the mighty fortress city, once a beacon of pack strength, looked like a rotting corpse. The massive outer walls were scorched black. The banners of the Ethelgard wolf had been torn down, replaced by the blood-red hawk of the Eastern Rebellion. An army was encamped outside the main gates. Thousands of tents, siege engines, and heavily armed soldiers. The Eastern lords had taken the city, and they were starving out whoever was left in the inner keep. Gareth pulled his massive gelding up beside me. He gripped the handle of his sledgehammer, his knuckles white. The 3 Oakhaven loggers behind us knocked arrows into their bows, their faces pale, but set in grim determination. 5 peasants against an occupying army. "Well, Maeve," Gareth rumbled, his eyes scanning the sea of steel and red banners. How exactly do we do this? Because I don't think they're going to just open the gate. I looked down at the heavy gold ring on my right hand. The magic inside my chest was a caged beast, snarling, thrashing against my ribs, desperate to be unleashed. I could feel the wolves in that army, hundreds of them, conscripted into the rebellion, their wolves confused, sickly, and crying out for an anchor. We don't ask them to open the gate, I said. We remind them who owns the wall. I kicked my horse into a trot, heading straight down the center of the muddy road toward the front lines of the rebel army. They saw us coming, a single rider leading a flatbed cart, flanked by 4 ragged peasants. It was so absurd that the rebel sentries didn't even draw their bows. They just stared. A contingent of heavily armored knights rode out to meet us, intercepting us 100 yards from the main camp. Their leader was a massive man with a scarred face, wearing a cloak trimmed in black bear fur. General Caspian. He was a ruthless brute, a man who had built his reputation on burning border towns. He reined in his warhorse, his men fanning out to block the road. He looked at me, then his eyes drifted to the pathetic, white-haired man tied to the back of the wagon. Caspian's eyes widened in disbelief, and then he threw his head back and roared with laughter. "By the goddess!" Caspian bellowed, pointing a gauntleted finger at Kalen. "Bram wasn't hallucinating. You actually found him, the false king, reduced to a dog on a leash." Caspian drew his broadsword. The steel scraped loudly in the quiet air. "Hand him over, woman. Lord Roderick wants his head for the spike. Do that, and I'll let you and your dirt farmers crawl back to whatever hole you climbed out of." I didn't draw my axe. I didn't reach for a weapon at all. I looked Caspian dead in the eyes. "You are standing on my dirt, Caspian." He sneered. "Your dirt. You're the exiled bitch. You have no pack. You have no name." "I am Maeve of the Ironwood," I said. My voice was calm, but the strange, dual resonance was back, echoing off the stone walls of the city. "And I am the Alpha of Exiled." I raised my right hand. The heavy gold ring caught the weak, grey sunlight. Then I stopped fighting the magic. I let the cage door open. The Alpha aura didn't release like a wave. It exploded like a bomb. A shock wave of pure, ancient dominance blasted outward, invisible but physically crushing. The snow around my horse vaporized instantly, leaving a perfect circle of scorched earth. Caspian's warhorse screamed and buckled to its knees. The knights behind him were thrown from their saddles as their mounts collapsed in sheer, instinctual terror. But it was the wolves who broke. Every werewolf in that army, hundreds of them, hidden within the ranks of human soldiers, felt the snap of the bond. It hit them like a physical blow to the spine. For 5 years they had been starved, decaying, operating in the dark. Now the sun had just gone off in their faces. Caspian, a pure-blood wolf himself, hit the mud hard. He tried to stand. He planted his sword in the dirt and pushed up, snarling, fighting the ancient biological imperative screaming in his blood. I dropped from my saddle. I walked toward him, my boots heavy on the earth. "Submit," I commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the law of the first wolves, backed by the raw, terrifying power of the Exiled ring. Caspian's eyes flashed gold, then rolled back. His arms gave out. He collapsed onto his stomach, pressing his face into the mud at my boots, his body trembling uncontrollably. A ripple effect tore through the army camp. Men dropped their weapons. Armor clattered against the frozen ground. From the front lines all the way to the siege engines at the rear, every wolf in the Eastern Rebellion fell to their knees and bared their necks. The human soldiers, terrified by the sudden mass submission of their strongest fighters, backed away in horror. Silence fell over the valley. A heavy, absolute silence. I walked past Caspian. I walked through the parted sea of kneeling, trembling soldiers. Gareth and the Oakhaven loggers followed close behind, their eyes wide, their weapons lowered. They didn't need them. I was the weapon. The heavy oak doors of the capital's main gate, splintered and battered from the siege, slowly creaked open. The loyalist guards inside had felt it too. I walked through the gates and into the city. The streets were lined with the starving, sick remnants of the pack. They looked like ghosts. But as I passed, they dropped to their knees, weeping, pressing their hands to the poisoned dirt. The moment my boots touched the cobblestones, the suffocating scent of rot began to thin. The magic was bleeding back into the stone. I didn't stop. I walked all the way up the steep, winding road to the inner keep. I pushed open the massive iron-wrought doors of the great hall. The room was exactly as I remembered it. The vaulted ceilings, the tapestries, the freezing stone floor. At the far end of the hall sat the Iron Throne. I walked down the central aisle, the exact path they had dragged me down 5 years ago. I reached the dais. I turned around. Gareth dragged Cailan in through the doors, throwing him onto the stone floor at the base of the stairs. The King of Ethelgard lay there, a broken, wheezing husk, staring up at me. "Maeve," Cailan choked out. "You saved them." "I saved the dirt," I corrected him, taking a seat on the freezing iron of the throne. I rested my elbows on the armrests, looking down at him. "You are going to fix the rest." He blinked, confused. "I have nothing left. I am dying." "You don't get the mercy of death," I said, my voice cold, ringing off the stones. "The earth needs blood to heal the rot you caused. Not mine. Yours." I looked at Gareth. "Take him to the northern mines. He works in the dark until his heart gives out. If he stops swinging the pickaxe, whip him. When he dies, throw his body in the furnace." Cailan didn't scream. He didn't beg. He just closed his eyes, tears squeezing past his lashes, and lowered his head to the stone floor. He had finally accepted his place. Gareth hauled him up by his collar and dragged him out of the great hall. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I sat alone on the throne. The hall was empty. The crown was mine. There was no joy in it, no romantic triumph. My hands were calloused. My heart was a hardened knot of scar tissue, and the kingdom I ruled was starving and broken. But as I looked down at the heavy gold ring on my finger, I felt the faint, distant heartbeat of the earth pulsing back to life. I survived the cold. I survived the wolves. And I would survive this. I leaned back against the iron. I was Maeve of the Ironwood, and I would never be broken again. If you loved the dark, brutal conclusion to Maeve's journey, smash that like button and subscribe for more intense fantasy storytelling. Drop a comment below. Did Cailan get what he deserved, or was the Northern Mines too harsh a punishment? Share this video with your friends who love a fierce, unforgiving female lead, and make sure you have the notification bell turned on so you don't miss our next original werewolf romance saga. See you in the next story.